The night fell over Cedar Hollow with a heaviness that seemed to press against the rusted metal of the trailers, each one a weather-worn coffin. The sky was an inked canvas, streaked with dying stars, and the only sound was the distant rasp of wind through broken windows, like a choir of mourners whispering in tongues no living soul could understand. In the center of this abandoned lot stood Jacob, his shoulders hunched against the chill that seeped into his bones. The park's walls, stacks of trailers leaning on one another as if to keep their secrets together, seemed to breathe with a slow, creaking rhythm. Every groan of metal and sigh of warped plywood was an echo of isolation that wrapped around him like a second skin. He had come here after the fire, after the betrayal that tore his world apart. The memory of flames licked at his mind still, but he had chosen to let them burn elsewhere, to let the night swallow them whole. In this place, there was no one to remind him of what had been lost, only the hollow thud of his own heartbeat and the rusted clatter that punctuated the silence. Jacob's routine was simple. Walk the perimeter with a flashlight in hand, listen for any movement, and then retreat to the back of the nearest trailer where he could watch over the lot like a guardian. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured against the uneven ground that had been scarred by years of neglect. The flashlight's beam cut through darkness, revealing peeling paint and twisted vines that clung to the walls like desperate fingers. He paused at the billboard, its faded lettering proclaiming "Home Sweet Home" in a font that had once promised comfort, but now only mocked him with its broken promise. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of its emptiness settle over his chest. The illusion of safety it offered was nothing more than a cruel jest. Here, home was a place where walls crumbled and memories burned. When he reached the back trailer, Jacob slipped inside, closing the door behind him with a hiss that sounded like a sigh from a dying beast. He set his flashlight on a stack of old newspapers, their ink faded by time, and lit a single candle. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows against the peeling walls. It was a small act of defiance against the darkness, a reminder that he still had agency over at least one small corner of this forsaken place. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his gaze fixed on the dim glow. The silence around him was thick, punctuated only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe or the creak of a trailer shifting in the wind. Each sound seemed amplified, each breath a drumbeat that echoed through the hollow lot. In that quiet, Jacob's mind wandered to the night of the fire, how the flames had danced across his world and left nothing but ash. He knew he could not escape that memory. It was embedded deep within him like a scar. Yet here, in this desolate park, he chose to let it lie dormant, buried beneath layers of routine and vigilance. His decision to keep moving forward, to remain in the shadows and watch over the lot, only tightened the walls around his heart. The solitude became a fortress, built from silence and guarded by the steady rhythm of his own presence. He could feel the weight of each choice he made, each step taken with purpose, building upon the last, creating an unbreakable barrier that kept him safe from the world's pain, but also from any possibility of connection. The night stretched on, the wind whispering through broken windows and rusted metal as Jacob sat in his solitary vigil. The fire's memory flickered like a distant flame, unseen yet ever present. He could feel its heat searing through his thoughts, threatening to ignite again if he let it. And as the candle guttered toward extinction, casting long shadows that danced across the floorboards, Jacob wondered, could this relentless isolation truly shield him from the past, or would it only deepen the chasm between him and the world? The night stretched like a black sheet over Cedar Hollow Trailer Park, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and made every creak of rusted metal feel like an accusation. Jacob walked the length of the lot, his footsteps echoing against concrete foundations that had once been houses, now hollow skeletons of hope. He carried a single candle, its flame wavering against the wind, a fragile defiance in a place that seemed to have given up on light. From somewhere beyond the tangled fence, a siren began to wail, a low metallic cry that cut through the stillness. It was not the distant emergency siren of a nearby town. It was something older, deeper, like the roar of a fire long past. The sound pressed against Jacob's ears, a thin thread of memory tugging at his thoughts. The memory was a scar, a blaze that had consumed an old house on the outskirts of a forgotten town. Flames licking the night sky, heat searing skin, the scent of smoke clinging to everything it touched. In that fire, a woman, his sister, had tried to save her mother, but the flames were relentless. Jacob's hands trembled as he remembered the sound of the siren that had rushed through the town's air, a desperate plea for help that never arrived in time. The siren's wail did not stop. It rose and fell like a heartbeat, echoing through the night. It was a reminder that some past cannot be buried under ash and silence. It will always call out, demanding attention. Jacob felt the old wound flare, a hot ache that pressed against his chest, tightening around his ribs as if trying to squeeze the breath from him. Yet he did not pause. He did not turn back. The candle's flame flickered, but did not die. It burned on, stubborn and bright. Jacob tightened his grip on the lantern, walked past the rusted trailers, and kept moving forward down the abandoned lot. His choice was simple yet profound: to ignore the siren's plea, to let the memory be another phantom that would haunt him if he dared to confront it. By ignoring the sound, by refusing to let the memory surface in the present, Jacob did not heal. Instead, he allowed the guilt to fester like a wound that had never been bandaged. The echo of that siren became a constant pressure against his thoughts, a reminder that his past was still alive and unquiet. It tightened his emotional walls, making them thicker with every step he took away from the sound. He felt himself becoming more isolated, not just by the physical distance from the town, but by an invisible barrier built of fear and shame. The candle's light grew dimmer as the wind pushed against it, a subtle metaphor for Jacob's own dwindling resilience. Each flicker seemed to echo the crack in his resolve. Each gust of wind felt like a whisper of the past that he chose not to hear. The siren continued its mournful call, and with every beat of its sound, Jacob's heart tightened further, as if the memory itself was tightening its grip on him. In the distance, the broken billboard, once a promise of comfort, now sagged under the weight of neglect, its faded words, "Home, sweet home," mocking the illusion of safety that had once drawn him here. The siren's echo seemed to mock him too, as if saying, "You think you can stay in this hollow and forget what burned your past? You cannot." The night pressed on. The wind grew colder, and the siren's cry faded into a distant memory itself. Jacob stood at the edge of the lot, feeling the weight of his choice like a stone lodged deep within his chest. He could not feel relief. He felt only the tightening of his emotional walls, as if they were being built around him by an invisible hand that held a torch lit with the fire's embers. Would the silence he sought be enough to keep the past at bay? Or would it only make the siren louder in the future, a relentless reminder that he could not outrun what had been set aflame? Could a man truly live in isolation and still carry the weight of betrayal and guilt without letting it seep into every breath he takes? The night had settled over Cedar Hollow like a damp shroud, the moon a thin silver eye peering through broken clouds. Jacob walked the cracked asphalt of the abandoned lot, his footsteps echoing against rusted trailers that stood like tombstones, their windows shattered and walls peeling with vines that clawed at forgotten promises. A lone billboard sagged in the distance, its faded paint whispering "Home, sweet home," as if mocking him for ever seeking shelter in a place designed to crumble. A low siren wailed faintly from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, a sound that had once signaled disaster and still carried the weight of loss. Jacob's chest tightened, His mind, a fragile vessel, flickered with memories of flames that had devoured everything he had known. He pressed on, unwilling to let the siren's mournful call dissolve into silence. At the edge of the lot, where a trailer lay abandoned and its doors ajar like a mouth opened in grief, something moved. A shadow, thin as breath, trembling against the peeling paint. It slipped through the gap between two rusted frames, drifting with the cold wind that cut across the deserted expanse. The movement was subtle, almost invisible, yet it stirred the air around Jacob's heart. His hand trembled on the grip of his lantern, its flame a lone candle in the darkness. He felt the weight of every unspoken word, every regret that had lodged itself deep within his ribs. The shadow moved with hesitant steps, as if unsure whether to enter or retreat, mirroring the uncertainty that gnawed at him from within. Jacob's instinct was to run, flee from whatever ghostly presence dared disturb the fragile order he had carved out of this desolation. Yet a part of him, stubborn and aching for something beyond the isolation he had chosen, urged him forward. He took one cautious step toward the trembling silhouette, his pulse thudding against the hollow in his chest like a drumbeat of impending revelation. The shadow paused, its outline blurring with the wavering light of his lantern. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath, as if the night itself were listening. Jacob's eyes locked onto the movement. He felt the walls that had kept him safe begin to erode, cracks forming where certainty once stood. He realized then that the fragile barrier of solitude, his shield against the world, was not a fortress, but a thin veil. Each step toward the shadow pulled at its edges, unraveling the isolation he had clung to like a lifeline. The silence around him became louder, each creak and groan of the abandoned trailers echoing his own unspoken doubts. In that instant, the darkness no longer seemed merely an absence of light. It was a presence, a living, breathing entity that mirrored his own turmoil. Jacob's lantern flame trembled against the wind, reflecting the tremor in his own heart. He understood that to confront whatever lay before him was not only to face a shadow, but to expose the buried guilt that had been feeding itself in the hollows of isolation. His resolve wavered as the air grew colder, and he felt the weight of every choice that led him here, choices that had built walls around his soul. He could turn back, let the night swallow him whole, or step further into the unknown, risking the collapse of the fragile sanctuary he had constructed from fear. Would stepping closer to the trembling silhouette be a surrender to the past, or an act of courage to reclaim what was lost? The sun had already slipped beneath the rusted roofs of Cedar Hollow when Jacob's silhouette carved a thin line against the crumbling backdrop. He moved like a ghost through the tangle of trailers, each one a relic of broken promises, their windows shattered and glass gossamer thin. Vines curled around sagging walls as if trying to reclaim what had been lost. The billboard, once bright with "Home Sweet Home," now lay cracked, its paint peeling into a jaundiced smear that mocked the notion of sanctuary. A breeze, thin as a sigh, slipped through broken panes and carried with it an electric chill that seemed to seep straight into Jacob's marrow. He stopped in front of a trailer whose roof had given way to the sky, exposing a skeletal frame that looked like a skeleton's ribcage. The wind rattled loose sheets of metal and sent a shiver up his spine, a reminder that even the earth here could not hold its own weight. From the shadows beyond the trailer's broken doorway, a glint caught Jacob's eye. It was small, almost insignificant against the vastness of the derelict park, but it pulsed with an unmistakable glow. Victor Hale's badge. The metal, tarnished yet still bright, reflected the dying light in a jagged flare that cut across the darkness like a knife. Victor had been a name spoken in hushed tones among the few who dared to speak of Cedar Hollow. His presence was a storm he carried with him, a threat wrapped in authority. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs, but he did not turn toward it. He drew back, keeping his distance as if the badge itself were a living thing that could bleed into his skin. His feet crunched on broken tiles, each step a metronome of dread and determination. The wind seemed to grow louder, carrying with it the distant echo of a siren, an old memory of his sister's fire, the taste of smoke still clinging to his tongue. The badge lay in its place, gleaming against the backdrop of decay, a silent sentinel waiting for an inevitable encounter. Jacob felt the weight of that moment settle over him like a blanket of ash. He could feel the ground shift beneath his feet. The air grew thicker, as if the park itself were holding its breath. In that suspended instant, the danger became undeniable. The badge was not merely a symbol, it was a promise of confrontation. Victor Hale's reputation for ruthlessness followed him like a shadow, and the very sight of his insignia on the horizon marked Jacob's refuge as a target. The sense of safety that had seemed to cling to the abandoned trailers evaporated into dust. The consequence was immediate. The stakes rose beyond mere survival. It was no longer about shelter from the wind or the memory of fire. It was about confronting an enemy who could strip away what little hope Jacob had salvaged. He could not afford to ignore the threat, yet he also could not risk a direct clash that would likely end in blood and loss. His choice, to observe from a distance, was a fragile balance between vigilance and avoidance. A thin line he walked with each breath. The wind howled, rattling the broken windows like a chorus of warning horns. Jacob felt the ground tremble beneath his boots, as if the earth itself were preparing for an onslaught. The badge's glow intensified, casting long, sinister shadows across the cracked asphalt. Every muscle in his body tightened, ready to spring into action or retreat into darkness. He could hear, faint but unmistakable, the low thud of footsteps approaching. Victor Hale was coming, his presence a palpable pressure that seeped through the rusted metal and into Jacob's marrow. The park seemed to close in around him, each broken trailer a silent witness to the inevitable collision of past sins and present choices. The wind carried a scent of oil and old rain, a reminder of the day the trailers were abandoned, of the lives that had once been here, of the betrayal that had turned this place into a mausoleum of false refuge. Jacob's eyes narrowed as he watched the badge glimmer against the dusk, knowing that any misstep could shatter his fragile peace. And then, as if the universe itself held its breath, Victor Hale stepped onto the cracked asphalt. His silhouette loomed larger with each step, a dark promise wrapped in authority. The badge gleamed brighter, reflecting the last rays of sun before they slipped into oblivion. Jacob's resolve flickered like the candle he carried, a single flame against the encroaching darkness. He could feel his heart pounding louder than ever, as if it were trying to escape from his chest. Yet even as fear clawed at him, a part of him understood that this was the moment where everything would change. The wind howled again, and the park seemed to tremble with anticipation. The stakes had risen, the danger had become undeniable, and Jacob's choice, watching from afar, had set the stage for a confrontation that could either free him or crush him under the weight of his past. Would this silent observation be enough to keep him alive, or would it lead to an inevitable clash that would strip away the last threads of hope? The night had settled over Cedar Hollow like a damp blanket, the wind rattling broken windows and bending rusted fences. In the dim glow of the cracked billboard, a single figure moved, a girl whose shoulders hunched against the chill, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow as if hunting something unseen. Hannah's breath fogged in the air. Each exhale was a small cloud that dissipated before it could be seen. She had slipped through a gap in the fence, fingers trembling as she pressed them against the cold metal. Her footsteps were muffled by overgrown grass and discarded cardboard, the world reduced to a series of muted thumps. Jacob watched her from the far end of the lot, his own breathing shallow, the rhythm of his heart echoing in his ears like a drumbeat. He had taken up residence among these skeletal trailers, turning them into a fortress of silence that kept the past at bay. Yet tonight, the silence felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. The obstacle unfolded when Hannah stepped closer to the nearest trailer, her hand reaching for the warped doorframe. She hesitated, then turned, eyes blazing with a fierce accusation that seemed to cut through the night air. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, voice low but edged with something sharper than fear. Anger, perhaps, or a desperate need for answers. "You know what happened to my mom. You know how you almost burned this place down." Her words hit Jacob like a sudden storm, the memory of the arson flickering into view, sharp and vivid as a flash. He felt the weight of his own guilt settle over him, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Choice!" Jacob's hand moved without thought, fingers brushing against the worn leather of a small backpack he had kept hidden beneath a tarp in one of the trailers. He lifted it with a deliberate slow motion, revealing a stash of canned beans, a packet of rice, and a few bars of chocolate, simple sustenance that could feed more than just bodies. It could nourish weary hearts. He stepped forward, his movement measured, each footfall a silent apology. "I have some food," he said, voice barely above a whisper. He held the bag out to her, offering it as an olive branch rather than a weapon. The gesture was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of their lives, but it carried the weight of his decision to share what little he had instead of keeping it locked away. The consequence unfolded like a fragile thread being tugged from both ends. Hannah stared at the bag, her eyes flickering between Jacob's face and the contents within. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, a blend of suspicion and something that could have been gratitude, if not for the shadow that still lingered in her gaze. She took the bag hesitantly, opening it to reveal the food inside. The aroma, stale beans, the faint sweetness of chocolate, filled the space between them, a small but potent reminder that even in desolation, nourishment existed. Her fingers tightened around the can of beans, as if it were a lifeline. Jacob watched her, his own eyes searching hers for any sign of betrayal or trust. He knew the road to redemption was paved with such fragile alliances, each step forward a gamble against the darkness that had claimed so much already. Hannah's shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension in her body eased just enough to allow a sliver of softness to creep into her features. The tentative alliance that formed between them was not born of love or loyalty. Those were distant concepts in this ruined landscape, but of necessity and an unspoken acknowledgement that they both survived because of each other. The night pressed on, the wind carrying with it whispers of the past and the promise of a fragile future. Yet as Jacob offered his modest gift, he felt something shift within himself, a small ember of hope igniting against the cold fire of his own remorse. Would this quiet act of sharing be enough to bridge the chasm between two broken souls, or would their bond crumble under the weight of Victor Hale's looming threat? The wind slipped through the broken windows like a cold hand, scattering dust motes that glittered in the dying light. Jacob stood at the threshold of the storage unit, its rusted metal frame groaning as if it too remembered the weight of secrets it had held for years. The trailer park lay behind him, tombs of plaster and peeling paint, vines clawing their way up crumbling walls, while ahead Victor Hale's silhouette loomed, a dark promise of violence. Victor stepped forward, his badge catching the last sliver of sun, flashing like a warning flare. He was a man who had made a name for himself in shadows, whose reputation was carved from fear and broken promises. His eyes were fixed on Jacob, with an intensity that made the air itself feel thicker, as if the very atmosphere were being pressed closer to their faces. Jacob's gaze flickered between Victor and Hannah, who stood a few paces behind him, her shoulders hunched, hands trembling around the edge of a battered cardboard box. She had been the first to step into the park, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. The memory of her mother's fire, her mother's death in flames that Jacob had started, hung over them like a funeral bell. Victor's voice cut through the silence, low and menacing. "You've got nowhere left," he said, his words laced with contempt. "This place is mine to burn." The obstacle was clear. Victor's presence threatened not only their lives, but also the fragile bond that had begun to form between Jacob and Hannah. The park itself felt like a trap, its broken walls closing in as if to swallow them whole. Jacob's choice came from a place deeper than fear, a flicker of resolve born from the ashes of his past. He stepped forward, taking a breath that tasted of dust and steel. "You're not going to get away with this," he said, voice low but steady. His hand tightened around a discarded metal sheet, the kind that had once been part of a broken fence. He moved with purpose, slamming the metal into place behind Hannah. The scrap metal scraped against the concrete, sending shards of rust into the air like tiny stars. He positioned it so that the narrow gap between the storage unit and the trailer park was sealed. An improvised barricade, a shield crafted from remnants of a life he had tried to leave behind. The consequence unfolded in an instant. The metal sheet caught Victor's foot as he stepped forward, sending him stumbling back with a grunt of frustration. His eyes narrowed. His hand tightened on the gun that lay tucked beneath his jacket. He was forced to look at Jacob and Hannah together, their bodies now a unified front against the threat that had once seemed insurmountable. Hannah's breath came shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven waves. She stared at the metal sheet with eyes that flickered between terror and awe. In that moment, the tentative alliance that had begun to form solidified into something unspoken, a partnership forged under fire, a mutual understanding that survival required more than mere avoidance. It demanded action. Victor's threat loomed closer still, but the barricade had shifted the balance of power. Jacob's choice, his willingness to use what little he had left to protect Hannah, had turned the tide. The metal sheet, cold and unforgiving, became a symbol of their newfound unity, a tangible barrier against the darkness that sought to consume them. The wind howled again, carrying with it the scent of rust and burning. Jacob's eyes were fixed on Victor, who now looked like a man caught between his own demons and the reality of being confronted by someone he had once feared. The air crackled with tension, every heartbeat echoing in the hollow spaces of the abandoned storage unit. And then, as if the universe itself paused to listen, Jacob turned toward Hannah, a silent question hanging in the space between them. He knew that this act, this shield of metal and steel, was more than a physical barrier. It was a promise that he would stand with her against whatever came next. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl? The night had settled over Cedar Hollow like a shroud of damp mist, swallowing the last sliver of sunset into its cold embrace. The trailers, once proud structures, now stood as skeletal ghosts, their corrugated roofs sagging, windows broken and glass splintered. A lone billboard, its paint peeling, the words "Home Sweet Home" barely legible, hung crooked above the entrance, a cruel mockery of sanctuary. Victor Hale's silhouette cut across the dim glow of a flickering street lamp as he stepped onto the cracked concrete. His boots made soft thuds against the rusted metal, each footfall a drumbeat in the silence that had become the park's only soundtrack. He was a figure carved from menace, his eyes sharp, his presence a threat wrapped in swagger. In the distance, Jacob stood beside Hannah, their bodies angled toward Victor as if bracing for impact. The air between them crackled with tension. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Jacob's hand tightened around the battered metal pole he had fashioned into a barricade, an old telephone wire twisted into a crude shield. His eyes were fixed on Victor, calculating, aware that every second could tip the balance between survival and death. Victor halted, his gaze flicking from Jacob to Hannah, then back again. The silence was broken by the low growl of his voice. "You think you can protect her? You're just a man who lit a fire in someone else's life." His words were thick with accusation, each syllable an arrow aimed straight at Jacob's conscience. Jacob's chest rose and fell with a shallow breath, the memory of the flames that had once consumed a house, his own hand set aflame by desperation, gnawed at him. He remembered the heat, the smoke curling up into the night sky like a funeral pyre, and the way it had left his hands raw, his heart scarred. Yet he also felt the weight of Hannah's fragile trust, her eyes searching for something that could not be given. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a single measured stride. The metal pole trembled under his grip, as if protesting his resolve. "You can't do this," he said, voice low and steady, the words barely audible over the hum of distant sirens. His hand was already reaching for the pole, fingers digging into its warped surface. Victor's eyes narrowed. A smirk twisted his lips. He raised a gun, the barrel gleaming under the weak streetlight, the metal cold against his palm. The sound of the trigger pulling was a hiss that sliced through the night. Jacob did not flinch. His body became an obstacle, a living wall between Victor and Hannah. He thrust himself forward, his arms outstretched, the pole clashing against the gun's barrel in a screeching collision. Bullets tore through metal and concrete, ricocheting off the twisted frame of the barricade. The sound was a cacophony, metal clanging, glass shattering, the sharp crack of gunfire that cut through the quiet like a knife. The first shot struck the pole, splintering it into jagged shards. It fell to the ground with a dull thud, its integrity compromised. Victor's grip tightened on his weapon as he recoiled, but his eyes remained fixed on Jacob, unwavering in his intent. The second round found its mark on the side of the barricade, sending sparks flying like embers from a dying fire. A burst of heat kissed Jacob's cheek. Sweat slicked his brow, mingling with the grime that had accumulated over months of solitude. The third bullet pierced through the pole's weakened structure, finding an opening in the wall of a nearby trailer. The impact sent a spray of dust and rust into the air, swirling around them like a storm of memories. The sound was a low, ominous boom, reverberating off the walls of the abandoned lot. Victor stood there, his face contorted with fury and determination, his gun poised for another shot. Jacob's chest tightened. He felt the sting of adrenaline surge through his veins. He could not let this moment slip by. The park, his sanctuary, his prison, was now a battlefield where his past and present collided. He shoved himself closer to Victor, forcing the distance between them into a razor-thin line. "Stop!" he shouted, voice cracking with raw emotion, each word a plea for humanity in a place that had long forgotten it. The consequence of his choice was immediate and brutal. The bullets ricocheted off the shattered barricade, striking the broken windows of the trailers, sending shards of glass into the night. One fragment pierced the side of Hannah's jacket, leaving a small but painful wound on her arm. The sound of metal against metal rang through the air, echoing the chaos that had erupted from Jacob's desperate stand. The park's safety was permanently compromised. The walls that once held them together now lay in tatters, and the sense of invulnerability that Jacob had clung to began to crumble like the rusted beams around him. The night seemed to widen, swallowing their world into a darker abyss, where every echo of gunfire was a reminder of how fragile protection could be. As Victor's gun fired again, each shot a threat to Hannah's life and to the fragile bond that had formed between them. Jacob felt the weight of his decision settle upon him. He had become both shield and sacrificial lamb, a man who had chosen to stand in the line of fire for someone he barely knew, hoping that this act of defiance would be enough to preserve what little hope remained. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect her? The night had settled into a heavy, humid hush over Cedar Hollow, the air thick with the scent of rusted metal and old gasoline. A sudden crack, a splintering of timber, cut through the silence, followed by a roar that rippled across the abandoned trailers like a living thing. Fire had taken root in the middle of the lot, lashing up from a derelict storage unit where flammable insulation lay exposed after a careless night of vandalism. The flames leapt sideways, licking the wooden beams and the cracked vinyl roofs, turning the twilight into an infernal glow that painted the sky with orange and crimson. Jacob felt the heat on his back as he stood near the perimeter, eyes narrowed against the searing light. The fire was a beast that had no respect for the fragile sanctuary they had carved out of this forgotten place. It devoured everything in its path: trailer shells, broken windows, the twisted skeletons of what once were homes. Smoke curled into the night sky, carrying with it the acrid taste of burning plastic and the metallic tang of scorched insulation. Hannah stood a few feet away, her breath shallow, eyes wide, as she watched the flames consume the very walls that had become their refuge. Her small hand clutched at Jacob's sleeve, trembling not from the heat, but from the realization that their only safe passage was now barred by inferno. The fire had claimed the leftmost exit, the one that had been the last line of defense against Victor Hale's relentless pursuit. Jacob's chest tightened as he weighed his options. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape before the flames closed in, but a deeper, older part of him, an echo of the guilt that had driven him to this forsaken lot, pulled at his resolve. He could not abandon Hannah now. She had become the only living thing left in this place that mattered. He stepped forward, heart pounding against his ribs like a drumbeat in war. The heat rose higher as he approached the blaze, the air turning thin and hot enough to taste iron. Jacob's mind flashed back to the night of the arson, the crackling of burning wood, the scream that had cut through the darkness. He remembered the weight of the gun in his pocket, the way it had felt like a promise of protection that turned into a burden of blood. The fire before him was a mirror, a literal and figurative blaze that forced him to confront what he had left behind. With a decisive breath, Jacob pushed aside a fallen beam that had become an unintended barricade. He dragged it away from the path, creating a narrow gap through which Hannah could slip. His hands shook as he moved the splintered wood, the sound of splintering echoing in the night like a mournful cry. The flames licked closer, licking at the exposed edges of the debris. "Come!" Jacob hissed into the roar, his voice barely audible over the crackling inferno. He did not speak of hope or salvation. He spoke only of survival, of the narrow corridor that would take them out of the fire's reach. His own body was a conduit of heat now, his skin blistering under the intense glare, sweat mixing with ash as it fell from his brow. Hannah glanced back once more at the wreckage of their sanctuary, her eyes flickering between the flames and Jacob's determined face. She nodded, a silent agreement to trust him, even though the path ahead was shrouded in smoke and uncertainty. The last exit on the opposite side of the lot remained obscured by darkness, but it offered the only chance, a single step away from the burning wreckage that had once been her home. Jacob's fingers tightened around the ragged edge of a broken railing, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. He knew that every second they lingered would bring them closer to the fire's hungry maw. Yet he also understood that if he chose not to act now, the flames would claim both their lives and the fragile hope that had kept them alive since they first stepped into Cedar Hollow. He lifted his arm and with a forceful push shoved the beam aside. The wooden splinters erupted in a shower of sparks as it hit the fire, briefly illuminating the darkness with a harsh white flare. In that moment, Jacob felt the heat surge against his skin, the blistering sensation searing through his arms. He did not flinch. He let the pain wash over him like a wave, knowing that his sacrifice would be measured in the distance between them and the fire's edge. As Hannah slipped through the gap, Jacob turned to face the blaze head-on. The flames licked at his jacket, searing the fabric as it clung to his chest. He could feel the heat blistering his skin, a burning that was both physical and metaphoric, an embodiment of every mistake he had ever made. Yet in that moment, there was no room for regret, only the unyielding resolve that had kept him alive since the night he first fled into this forsaken lot. The fire roared louder, as if answering his silent defiance. Smoke swirled around Jacob's shoulders, a choking veil that threatened to swallow his vision. He could feel the heat on his face, the sting of ash against his lips. He pushed forward, stepping through the narrow corridor that led towards the darkness beyond the flaming wreckage. Behind him, the fire consumed everything that had been their refuge. Trailer shells, broken windows, the cracked billboard that once proclaimed, "Home, sweet home." The light from the blaze painted the scene in a grotesque tableau of destruction. Yet as Jacob moved, he felt something shift within him, a release of the weight of guilt that had burdened his heart for years. He was no longer the man who had fled into this place to escape betrayal. He was now the man who stood between a living girl and an infernal maw, offering her a chance at survival. When Jacob finally reached the last exit, the fire's roar thinned, replaced by the distant hiss of dying embers. He turned once more, looking back at the smoldering ruins that had been their sanctuary. The heat was still intense, but the flames were no longer directly upon him. He saw Hannah standing beside him, her face illuminated by the glow of the fire's remnants. She looked up at him, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Jacob lifted his hand, palm open as if offering more than just an exit. The heat kissed his skin, but he did not flinch. He understood that in this moment he had paid the ultimate price, his sanctuary, his potential escape route, his chance to stay hidden from Victor Hale's relentless pursuit. Yet through that sacrifice, he had given Hannah a new path forward, a fragile thread of hope woven into the ashes of their past. The night fell quiet again, the fire finally dying down to embers that hissed in the wind. Jacob stood there, breathing heavily, his body aching from heat and exhaustion. He felt the weight of the loss he had endured, but also the sense of redemption that surged within him like a quiet tide. The future was uncertain, the road ahead uncharted, yet the choice he made had carved a new possibility into the night. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl? The night had settled over Cedar Hollow like a shroud of ash, the air thick with the metallic tang of burnt paint and damp earth. A single flicker from a broken street lamp threw jagged shadows across the rusted trailers, turning their peeling siding into a mosaic of decay. Victor Hale's silhouette loomed at the far end of the lot, a dark figure against the pale glow of the fire that still licked the charred remains of the storage unit. His presence was a knife in the quiet, a reminder that every corner held danger. Jacob stood between the crumbling frame of Trailer 12 and Victor's relentless gaze. The last exit, a narrow gap beneath the sagging roof of Trailer 14, was barred by a hastily erected barricade of broken wood and twisted metal, its surface slick with sweat and the remnants of a desperate fight. The crack in the wall was the only promise of freedom, but it was guarded by Victor's unwavering stare, his hand resting on the barrel of a gun that had already tasted life. The obstacle was clear. The path to escape lay beneath a barrier that could not be breached without drawing fire. Every instinct screamed at Jacob to retreat, to let Hannah run, while he stayed behind as bait. Yet the memory of her trembling shadow slipping into an abandoned trailer earlier in the day, her fragile trust broken by his own hesitation, burned hot within him. He felt the weight of that choice settle on his shoulders like a stone. He chose instead to become the distraction, to lure Victor away from the exit with a selfless act that would cost him everything he had fought for. Jacob's eyes narrowed as he scanned the surrounding wreckage for any sign of vulnerability. The wind carried the scent of burning oil and scorched plastic. It was a symphony of destruction that seemed to whisper his resolve. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, drawing Victor's attention with a silent, almost imperceptible shift of body weight. Jacob's voice, when he spoke, was low and steady, an echo of the calm he had cultivated in the solitude of Cedar Hollow. "Hannah," he said, not to her, but to the space between them. "Run!" The word hung in the air, a fragile lifeline. Victor's eyes flicked toward the gap, then back to Jacob, his hand tightening around the gun. The tension was palpable. The very ground seemed to tremble with anticipation. Jacob seized the moment. He lunged toward the barricade, pushing against the twisted metal with all his strength. The wood splintered under his force, and a jagged edge cut through the barrier like a knife through flesh. As he tore at it, the sound of cracking metal echoed like gunfire in the still night. Victor's gaze followed Jacob's motion. His hand began to shift from the barrel to his side. The distraction was perfect. In that instant, Hannah slipped into the narrow gap beneath Trailer 14, her small frame slipping through the space as if it were a secret passage. She emerged on the other side with a gasp, her eyes wide with relief and fear. The consequence of Jacob's choice unfolded like a slow-burning ember. Victor Hale was pulled away from the exit, his focus now on the unexpected attack that had just rattled the barricade. His attention was divided. His gun slipped from his grasp for a heartbeat, enough for Hannah to pull herself fully into safety and sprint toward the dim glow of dawn. Jacob's body trembled as he watched Hannah disappear into the darkened corridor. The fire's heat rose against his back, its orange glow painting his face with an almost holy light. He felt the weight of his decision, his sacrifice, settle over him like a mantle. The last exit was now free for her. The path that had once seemed impossible had been opened by his desperate act. The night air shifted as if in response to his choice, carrying away the echo of gunfire and leaving behind only the quiet thrum of the wind through broken windows. Jacob stood alone amid the ruins of Cedar Hollow, knowing that he had carved a way forward for Hannah, but at the cost of his own safety. The fire still burned, but its glow was no longer a threat. It became a beacon of hope in the darkness. Would this final act of defiance be enough to protect the girl?